Well, my thanks to Augusta and to Promoting Enduring Peace and all of our friends here in Connecticut for just providing this opportunity to be here and to share with you a little bit about what I know about Cuba, about some of the work that we've been involved in. It's inspiring for all of us that work at IFCO Pastors for Peace to be able to sort of get out and talk to our friends and members of the vast network of people that really allow for this work to happen. There is no way that there would be a caravan, a U.S.-Cuba Friendshipment caravan without the support of people across the country. The IFCO office, the IFCO staff is really very small. It's amazing. I'll pat us on the back a little bit. It's amazing what we're able to do with such a small number of people actually working in the office. But it's really because of the energy that we are fed by people across the country who make up the stops and make up the events that we hold in different communities and help to support the vehicles that make their way down, that collect the aid, and each that have their own unique story about how they got involved, what ways they've been able to get their neighbors kind of turned on and exposed to this work. Their neighbors, their people in their work environment, their churches, their synagogues, wherever their community exists. It's a part of the extended community that gets to be exposed to information about Cuba, learn more about Cuba, and ideally, if we do what we should be doing correctly, we get folk excited enough to actually travel on the caravan and ride on those buses and go to Cuba, have that experience, and more importantly, return home after having had that experience to talk about the reality that's on the ground there. Because really the most important aspect of the caravan is the information sharing. It's really about breaking down myths and exposing our neighbors, our friends, our work colleagues, whomever, wherever we can get an audience, exposing people to a different perspective on Cuba. And that's really been the strength of the Friendshipment Caravan. You all know the story, and you just heard a little bit from my dad there, talking about the history of the caravans, how they got started. There was a counterattack that took place while, ironically, it was the first delegation that I had co-led with him to Nicaragua back in 1988. And as we were traveling from the Creole-speaking, predominantly black section of Nicaragua, heading back to Managua, we were on a passenger ferry that was attacked by Contra forces. And we were on a really small, rudimentary passenger ferry that initially the attack initially started out with individual gunfire. I'm not a gun person, so I don't know, all I know is what sounded like a pistol, what I assumed. And that was followed by what sounded to me like automatic gunfire, blah, 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 and then followed by heavy artillery, where the boat was literally violently shook from side to side. And without a doubt, and I've lived a few years, it was the most frightening, continues to be the most frightening experience I ever had. We really, I think all of us believed that was it. We were not going to make it off that boat. And it was really sort of like the Old West, the cavalry came to the rescue. And the cavalry in this case were young, and I mean young kids, really, Nicaraguan soldiers, Sandinista soldiers, who literally kind of rode side by side with the passenger ferry, kind of fighting off the Contra who had really ambushed us. And when we first heard their boots kind of on the deck, boom, boom, I'm thinking, oh, this is it. I can't believe that this is, how this is all going to end. I'm too young to die. But it turned out that it was the Sandinista soldiers, and they had come indeed to rescue us. In that attack, as you know, there were several, 29 people who were wounded, 2 people who were killed, but one of the wounded was my dad. And as you heard him express it, he was pretty ticked off. And they made a mistake that day. I mean, they kind of shot a guy who was fairly, had an audience, and it was fairly, could speak very well, and knew how to kind of get attention. And he literally, as he lay in the hospital bed that night, conceived of the Pastors for Peace project as a response. The idea being how do we organize a response against such act of terror, such act of violence? We do that by getting people, like-minded people, to say, we'll one-up you. We're going to bring a caravan back to Nicaragua, packed with vehicles packed with humanitarian aid, collected in communities like this, in schools and churches and hospitals and wherever people of conscience reside, and that's what happened. So 6 months later, that first caravan came back into Nicaragua. The attack happened in August of 1988, and the first caravan to Nicaragua arrived Christmas Eve, 1988, and it was a really quite a inspiring, emotional, memorable experience. But that's how we started. That was the very first caravan, and we did several caravans to Nicaragua and other parts of Central America, because as you all know, this was during the height of the Contra War. This was at the height of the Reagan administration that was claiming that people like the Sandinistas were the bad guys and the Contra were the good guys, and it was all about, again, information sharing, trying to really change the narrative, getting people to recognize that there was a campaign, an intentional campaign of misinformation that was being perpetrated to get people in the United States to be opposed to forces like those that were running the country in Nicaragua at that time, the Sandinistas. Fast forwarding many years later, we had the fortune of meeting a Baptist minister, a community organizer from Cuba, Reverend Raul Suarez, who had seen what was going on in Nicaragua and had approached my dad and said, listen, we think you ought to try to organize a caravan to Cuba. Cuba was going to be a different nut kind of to crack. There was a blockade, there was an embargo, there was fines and imprisonment for traveling, there was the trading with the enemy. There were all of these layers of complexity that were going to make that much more of a difficult hurdle. But my dad never saw a hurdle that he didn't like to jump over, and particularly, I think, when it came to matters of justice. And so, even though, and as you heard in that interview that I was saying, I kept thinking, I don't know how we're going to do this. I just can't, I don't know. I'm going to follow along, but I'm not sure that I see how we're going to do it. And sure enough, we did. As many of you know, those early caravans were really something. I mean, it was the caravans were really seen as a fresh new approach to protesting our government's policy toward Cuba and allowing the people of the U.S. in particular, because it's our government that's blockading Cuba, while we had friends coming from other countries to participate, it was really the policy of the U.S. and the people of the U.S. that we felt were needed to be in the forefront. And so we were able to organize this incredible caravan that first year in 1992. I think there were over 100 people who participated. There must have been about 15 or so vehicles, buses, all brightly colored, as many of you have had an opportunity to see, packed. I mean, packed to the gills with medical supplies, school supplies. In this case, in that first caravan, Bibles, bicycles, powdered milk. And ironically, things like bicycles, powdered milk, priests, literally in collars, carrying Bibles. You would assume that, I don't know, the government might sort of kind of back off, but they really, in many ways, helped us. There's one picture, I don't know if any of you know, there was a late Reverend Paul Mayer, who was on that very first caravan, who was carrying, he had his collar on, he had literally carrying a Bible in one hand, and one in each hand. And there's this really powerful photo that got taken of the border officials kind of just trying to strip the Bibles from his hands, and he's holding on to them, and it didn't make them look too good. And they tried to take those from him. There was a young woman who was riding a bicycle that she was going to take to deliver to Cuba, and the border officials kind of literally sort of tackled her. She actually had to go to court. She won her court case. But there were all of these images of people resisting a policy of blockade, a genocidal policy, using words that our friends in Cuba use all the time when you really think about the impact of the embargo, the blockade. That there are these images of people resisting and sort of the power structure holding them down, stripping them of these material goods, are really powerful images that were helpful in getting, I think, the vast majority of people in the country, in the United States, to really support the caravan effort, and even some members of Congress. There was even, I think, media outlets that had been kind of suspicious of what we were doing, but there was one CNN cameraman who was in the middle of, sort of videotaping this, and he kind of got jostled around, and the police wound up arresting him. Well, that got him really ticked off, and they wound up producing even more favorable stuff about what we were doing. But those were the beginning. That was sort of the beginning of this movement in the early 1990s. Started in 92, 93. Many of you know the story of the little yellow school bus that was seized, an innocent little school bus that was being taken to Cuba, that was stopped, and the occupants, my dad and several others that were on that bus, held a hunger strike for 23 days. And that was a powerful, powerful time. There were many of us, myself included, that went to different cities and tried to muster up support for them. They were isolated down at the border in Laredo, Texas, hot, 110 degrees, on the school bus in a compound, kind of away from the view of the media and the view of the world. So our job was to kind of go to Houston and New York and San Francisco and other places where there were Treasury departments, and to protest in front of Treasury, and to engage in civil disobedience, getting arrested, but as a way that we could draw attention to what was happening in Laredo. And it was an amazing time. And many of you, I think, were involved in the campaigns to win the release of that bus. We collectively were able to call Washington and literally just completely shut down the telephone switchboard at the Department of Treasury with our calls to demand the release of that school bus. They finally relented and let the bus go. And that was an inspiring and empowering a time. So that's kind of the history, and I know many of you know that history, and there are a lot of people who say, well, okay, that was great, wonderful, great memories, 1992, 93, early 90s. What about now? Here we are, 2014. We're still doing this. Is it worth still doing? And my argument is, I think that it is. And I want to talk a little bit about why I feel that it is important that we continue this work. Um, there were many things that the government prohibited us from taking on those early caravans, as some I've just mentioned. Some as simple as a school bus, powdered milk, um, uh, obviously medicines, Bibles, bicycles, uh, things as simple as a toaster. I know it sounds really crazy. I'm not even sure why a toaster was on the caravan in the first place, but it was an interesting lesson we learned. The government officials said, no, this toaster can't go. Nothing with an electrical cord. And they literally took the toaster and cut the cord. And they said, okay, now you can take the toaster. But it just showed, again, it was the imagery. It just showed the insidiousness of a policy that would say you can't take a toaster to Cuba. The arguments were crazy, that these were going to be used or could be used by the Cuban military to do great harm. And that was the kind of mentality that we were, struggling and fighting against. Those items can go now. School buses and powdered milk and Bibles and bicycles and, I guess, toasters, if we were to take toasters. Certainly sewing machines. We took a bunch of sewing machines last caravan, which was it was wonderful to see those being so appreciated by the Cubans. The point is that I think that we've pushed the envelope. That was always been the intent, to push the envelope, to try to be creative, to try to come up with new and different ways to really show our opposition, not only our love for the Cuban people, but also our opposition to a policy that would prevent these items from going. So what we've done is we've upped the ante. Slowly but surely we've upped the ante. We continue to look for new and creative ways to up the ante, and that's a challenge. It's difficult. It's difficult because I think in the beginning, when we had these officials that were tackling priests with Bibles or tackling a young woman on a bicycle or saying, no, a toaster can't go, or this box of powdered milk can't go, the image of that, they looked horrible. They really looked bad. And that was beneficial to us because it really showed why we needed to engage in this act of civil disobedience to take our aid to Cuba. And they, I think, learned their lesson. And it made it much more difficult for us. But it didn't mean, and it does not mean, in our opinion, that we should not continue the caravans. We think that the idea of continuing to go without a license, continuing to be there intentionally without a license, without asking permission, without requesting a permit, because we feel that to do that really just gives power to a policy that allows the government to tell us when we can go, where we go, how we go. I already said when. I mean, they've got so many controls over how it is that we relate to our brothers and sisters in Cuba, and we feel that that's unjust. And so we continue to do this. And we think that it's important to have that presence there, and also to have the educational events where we're talking in different communities about Cuba's work, its commitment, its methodology, it's the model that Cuba represents, and all of these different spheres. So whether it's on we're talking about education, environmental sustainability, gender rights. I mean, Cuba has really been a model when it comes to the whole issue of same-sex relationships. That's a whole different way of thinking about that in Cuba than exists in many areas of the world. When we talk about the issue of literacy, Cuba has really, been at the forefront of providing a whole different way of making sure that each and every person has reached a certain level of literacy. Obviously, healthcare has been really a primary area where Cuba has made an incredible contribution. we all know, I think those of you who've seen the recent New York Times headlines or editorials, I mean, the issue of Cuba is very timely right now, but it's been amazing to see editorial after editorial after editorial, whether it's about Ebola or it's about the Cuban Five, the five Cuban men who were unjustly tried and imprisoned for fighting terrorists, for fighting terrorist attacks on their country, for infiltrating organizations here in the United States that were either flying over the country and dropping leaflets and terrorizing people, that were helping to organize sort of drive-bys, if you will, really engaged in terrorist activities against the Cuban people year after year. And these five men said, enough is enough, and infiltrated organizations. And when they got enough evidence of what these terrorists were planning and informed the FBI, the FBI didn't arrest the terrorists, they arrested the five. And five of the men, as you know, have been released, and two of the men have been released, too many numbers. Two of the men have been released, three are still in custody, and we continue to lift up their case. But these editorials in the New York Times, where you've got the New York Times talking about the Cuban Five, talking about Alan Gross, and if you know Alan Gross, the young, well, not so young, man from the United States who's in prison in Cuba for really trying to bring equipment and communication equipment, and et cetera, to Cuba against Cuban laws. And so there's this swap that could happen, and many of us are hopeful that it will, that the three can be swapped for Alan Gross. But there's this focus on the blockade, the embargo, pushing on President Obama to lift the blockade. I'm hopeful that all of these are signs that before he leaves office that such a thing can happen. I think one of the comments that was made in the editorial about Alan Gross by the New York Times that indicated that should he die in prison, that U.S.-Cuba relations will be pushed back, way back. And so of course we're all hopeful that does not happen, that he does not die, that that there's enough time to negotiate this switch between those prisoners. There's so many different things that one can talk about, because like I said, there's so much going on in the news with Cuba. Augusta mentioned, but I wanted to just talk a little bit about the fight, the valiant fight that Cuba's engaged in around Ebola. 460 plus medical professionals. While people are in a panic, whether that's here or across the globe, about Ebola and catching Ebola and what to do with the healthcare workers, and it's kind of just insane. While people are running away, the Cubans are running too. I mean, it's just an example of the kind of commitment that our Cuban brothers and sisters have made in the area of healthcare and social medicine. So it's amazing that despite the attempts by the mainstream media and the U.S. to ignore Cuba's presence in West Africa, the world is watching. Cuba can't be ignored. And it's kind of wonderful to see praise from the World Health Organization, from the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, to see all these things in the New York Times. Even the U.S. UN Ambassador Samantha Powers had to give credit to the physicians, the Cuban physicians fighting Ebola. You've heard, not as much as I would have liked, but Secretary of State John Kerry also say some favorable things, but people are at least acknowledging and recognizing. And the reason that's important is because for so long, it didn't matter what Cuba did. It was the fact that it was Cuba that meant, sort of just blind eye, ignore them. I'll never forget during some hurricane, I don't know which hurricane it was, um, and I'm looking at the map of the weather map. I'm watching the weather, and literally the weather people had just wiped Cuba off the map. I'm like, it's not, where's Cuba? Cuba's not even there. It just wasn't there. It just didn't exist. And meanwhile, it was, a Cuba that, as we all know, has done tremendous work in the area of hurricane preparedness and has been, again, a model. Um, so, even Fidel has called on the U.S. to, work with Cubans to fight the deadly disease. And, while the U.S. has been, expert at exporting war and weapons, Cuba has historically exported doctors. And it's widely believed that medical workers are Cuba's most important export commodity. But fighting Ebola in West Africa is just one example. It's not the first. And I just think it's worth mentioning just some the other examples. In the 70s, Cuba, of course, sent doctors to help out, and not only doctors, but teachers in Nicaragua. Cuban medical missions were sent to Honduras and Guatemala and Haiti following 1998's Hurricane Mitch and Hurricane Georges. Since 1990, Cuba has provided long-term care for 18,000 victims of the Chernobyl disaster, offering treatment for hair loss, skin disorder, cancer, leukemia, and other illnesses attributed to radioactivity. Following the 2004 Asian tsunami, Cuba sent medical assistance to Banda Aceh and Sri Lanka. In response to Hurricane Mitch, Cuba prepared to send 1,500 doctors to New Orleans. And tragically, the offer was refused, but several months later, the mission was dispatched to Pakistan following the Kashmir earthquake there. Ultimately, Cuba sent more than 2,500 disaster response experts, surgeons, family doctors, and other health personnel to that region where they served for 6 months. We know that hundreds of medical professionals arrived in Haiti following the 2010 earthquake. And then, of course, we have to mention the medical school scholarship program. Many of you know that Cuba has opened its doors to people from various nations to come and to study medicine and to receive their degree, MD, totally free, providing education and clothing and food and books and all that a person needs to study at the Latin America School of Medicine, which is ironically was a naval base that Cuba transformed into a school of learning of medicine. Again, just I think an important connection to make, that they took a place of potentially war and violence and created an institution for higher learning in medicine. In the year 2000, thanks to a generous offer by then President Fidel Castro, the U.S. candidates were accepted into the program. And IFCO has had the honor of being the organization in the United States to help recruit and facilitate the opportunities for U.S. Applicants. And last summer, there was an incredible graduation class that I just beam and smile just thinking about these young doctors that have now returned to the U.S. and will be serving for a period of time in underserved communities here in the United States. And that's the only caveat, that's the only requirement that's asked of the students, to return and provide service in underserved communities here in the U.S. And there are currently, to date, more than 111 graduates, 107 currently enrolled, and 37 in residency or practicing medicine, having gone through the 6 to 7 year program. So it's really been an incredible experience to be a part of that and to see these wonderful young people really that wanted to become physicians but couldn't afford the quarter of a million on up, $500,000, whatever it is, a whole lot of money to become a doctor, to study here in the United States. And as another testament to Cuba's medical, its approach to global medicine, there were a bunch of Elam graduates who have been asking for permission to join the doctors in West Africa and the fight against Ebola. Recognizing that this is no joke, recognizing that it's a very serious situation, but saying this is what we trained for. This is why, we became doctors. Some of them, I got a chance to talk to a couple that visited the office, and I said, that's really admirable, but that's, this is really, it's frightening. It's frightening times, and aren't you worried about your own safety? And their response was, we've been trained to do just this. We know that there's, special training that's required for any of the doctors going into the Ebola-stricken areas, and that they would need to obviously get up to speed with that. But there was just such a sense of duty and responsibility and desire to help. So that word has been passed on to the Ministry of Health in Cuba, and I don't know what will happen, but just the fact that they have offered and wanted to kind of be on the front lines is, I think, just a testament to these incredible revolutionary doctors, really. So we'll see what happens with them. But these are just some examples of Cuba's commitment to the world, despite being blockaded by a government that's considered the most powerful nation in the world. And as Augusta mentioned, just last week, the United Nations once again voted to condemn the blockade, calling on the U.S. to end its decades-long economic blockade against Cuba. And she told you the numbers, 188 to 2, with 3 abstentions. The 2 being the United States and Israel that voted to keep the policy in place, and the abstentions being Palau, Micronesia, and Marshall Islands. So, but it was amazing. I did have the opportunity to be at the General Assembly during the vote and to listen to the Foreign Minister, Bruno Rodriguez, who described the human damages caused by the blockade as tremendous. He said, with 76% of Cubans living under its devastating effects since the day they were born. I mean, 76% of Cubans that have been living under this policy ever since they were born. The resulting economic damages accumulated after half a century amounted to more than $1 trillion. The embargo was also the main obstacle to broader access to internet, as well as the exchange of ideas and the development of cultural, sports, and scientific relations. The blockade, these were things that he mentioned, that the blockade has been further tightened under President Obama's administration, particularly in the financial sector. The United States has historically used the enormous technological power of its recently denounced mass espionage system. Have many of you heard about this Zonzinio? Sort of an effort to really use, knowing that there were young people that were trying to use Twitter to communicate, to try to infiltrate that so that they were sending out information to each other, sort of very propaganda, but it was using social media to sort of get young people to sort of turn against the revolution in the government, and it was figured out and sussed out and sort of quashed, but it's just another example of sort of this continuous campaign of difficulty that the U.S. government has perpetrated against Cuba for all these years. From January 2009 to September of 2013, fines have been imposed on 30 U.S. and foreign entities for relations with Cuba and other countries, which amounted to more than $2.4 billion. So it's fines on individuals and fines on companies for trading with Cuba, companies that were either have any kind of a U.S. Ownership or interests. This is in violation of the trading with the enemy law. But those, so there's sort of, instead of kind of coming out boldly and tackling the priest with the Bible or the young woman on the bicycle and that sort of bad image, there's all of this sort of insidious kind of stuff behind the scenes, which has made it difficult for these companies to continue to do any kind of trade with Cuba. And those fines have amounted to $2.4 billion. I mean, it's a nice little payday for the U.S. Treasury. But that's how the U.S. government's chosen to treat Cuba, despite Cuba's embrace, in many ways, of the international community. We were honored that the foreign minister mentioned in his speech, Pastors for Peace. He said, "There's no hostility between our people. Cuba extends hospitality to the small number of North Americans which are permitted by their government to visit and those who assume the risk to do so, as well as those who come bringing humanitarian aid like Pastors for Peace or to study medicine in our country." So, Cuba, like I said, continues to be an example on so many different levels. An example of environmental sustainability. It's been successful models in the area of food, housing, health that are now widely replicated throughout Latin America. Cuba also leads the world in hurricane planning and is an island nation, is acutely aware and already researching climate change vulnerability of coastal zones. It's also created an alternative model of development that places ecology and humanity at its core. So it's become a world leader in ecological, organic, and urban agriculture. So many more things that could be said. I mean, certainly about the case of the Five, Alan Gross, Zunzaneo, the increasing support among world leaders in the hemisphere calling for the end of the blockade, being at the UN. I mean, country after country after country really just talked about the significance of not having Cuba at the table in some of these, world arenas. So whether it was CARICOM, the nations of in the Caribbean, or ALBA, the nations in South America, the various, groupings of the group of, what is it? Group of 77 plus China. It struck me just how these different pockets of nations were all unified in their opposition to a policy that was denying one of their member states the ability to thrive and participate equally at the table. So lots to talk about. Time is obviously, limited, but in short, it's clear that there are changing attitudes around Cuba. So whether that's in the Cuban American community, there have been poll after poll, which has been quite fascinating, amongst more politically conservative politicians. I mean, you've got people like Christ, the guy in Florida. Not that, yeah, Christie. But I know there's a former governor, is he in Florida? He's running, right? Okay. But, I mean, he sort of backtracked. I mean, initially he was saying, we really ought to lift the blockade. He kind of sort of backtracked away from that. But it's just interesting, these pockets of people. I think Kathy Castor, she's from Tampa. And there's others, but I mean, that are really sort of speaking out against the blockade and the desire to lift it. And then, of course, within mainstream media, I mean, the string of New York Times editorials has been really, I think, fascinating. Hillary Clinton and her book recently. I mean, and some are a little more, obviously genuine than others. But just the fact that there's like, bing, 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 one after another that are kind of really speaking out about this 50-plus-year-old, antiquated, outdated, fill in the blank, policy, I think is impressive and hopefully significant, and will mean that things will change. So it does seem that Cuba is certainly more visible today than it's been, in the longest time. And my hope is that we collectively, we IFCO pastors, we as a network of people that have been, interested in peace and changing attitudes, whether it be here in Connecticut or across the country, will be the voices that will continue to rise up and speak out against the blockade and work to see it lifted once and for all. But thanks for being here. You could be anywhere else tonight. You came to listen to me drone on a little bit, but I really appreciate all that you've done. I'm looking forward to perhaps talking to a few people. I'm looking over there at my dear friend Luce, who's talking about maybe going on the caravan next summer. I want to say very quickly that many of you know, the caravans have been the face of the caravan has been these brightly colored vehicles that kind of come through, and it's inspiring, and it's really an important part of getting people pumped up and connected to the project. But we've had to think differently about how do we do this project? How do we do it in a way that, number one, allows us to hold on to what our Cuban friends acknowledge is important. That's the educational events. Putting, Cuba on the tips of the tongues of people and at the water coolers and talking about Cuba in a different way, challenging the myths. So that's one piece that's very important. Our network values those colorful buses, and we do too, and we understand that they're really important and helpful with organizing. And we, IFCO pastors, try to figure out how do we do this in a way that's economically viable and sustainable, because it does cost to fuel these fuel-hungry buses down the roads. And so I'm hopeful that there'll be ways that we can all kind of come to the table and talk about ways that we can creatively continue to do this in a way that makes sense. My hope is, though, that we'll have some vehicles on the road come next summer. In the back of the table, there's a sign-up sheet, and anybody who's got any thoughts or wants to be a part of that dialogue about, how do we think about doing this work that's been a mainstay, since 1992. How do we think about doing that a little differently? And I'd love to hear any thoughts or be in touch with you. So please make sure to sign up on that sign-up sheet and check that off, and I'll give you a call, and we'll just kind of talk it through. But we're excited, most definitely, about continuing to be in solidarity with Cuba and to continue that, no matter what that caravan looks like, with our caravan project until we see an end to the blockade, and see you all being a really important part of that. So be prepared. I'm going to be calling. But thank you. Just thanks so much for being here tonight. Appreciate it. Thank you.